This is how I refurbish a PlayStation 2. I first start off by testing the original laser in the console. I use a black PlayStation 1 disc, a blue PlayStation 2 disc. Those both use the CD diode on the laser to read the discs. I will then proceed to use a silver PlayStation 2 disc and a gold PlayStation 2 disc, or for this instance, because I don't own a PlayStation 2 disc that has a gold layer, I use a gold layer DVD for this instance to test the DVD diode. As for removing the top shell of the PlayStation 2, it depends on the model, but there's normally anywhere between 6 or 8 Phillips head screws on the bottom of the console to remove the top shell of the PlayStation 2. Once I have the top shell removed, I will then go ahead and remove the cover of the disk drive. This is normally held on by 4 very small Phillips head screws. Once I have the disk drive cover removed, I then remove the disk tray itself, held on by 2 more very small black Phillips head screws. I lift one side of the disk tray up and then slide the rest of it out. This will reveal the laser and the spindle of the disk drive. From there, I remove one small Phillips screw that holds in the rail that the laser slides on. I will then lift it up and remove the original laser for testing. I will then disconnect the ribbon cable holding the laser in place and test it under a microscope. As shown here, you can see the 2 diodes on the bottom of the laser. One is for the DVD and the other one is for the CD. I will then use a multimeter to read the ohms on the CD and the DVD diode. Touching the 2 small leads will give you a good reading. The DVD diode should be between 1300 and 1100 ohms, and the CD should be around 1100 to 950 ohms. You do not want to tweak the diodes past 950, as this will shorten the lifespan of the laser itself. You can reasonably go down to around 800 to 850 ohms, but again, this will shorten the lifespan of the laser. So if it is the original laser and you have to tune the diodes down that far, I would recommend potentially getting ready to replace the laser itself with a good aftermarket unit. If you need to tweak the diodes, I use a very small flathead screwdriver bit. This is out of my kit, but it uses a small 1.5 flathead bit. As for tweaking the diode, you really want to do very small increments, no more than a maybe quarter or eighth of a turn. Very small movements will give you a large jump, so take that into consideration. A very small tweak like this might go from 1100 down to 1000 or vice versa, or it might give you a jump from 950 to 1100. So take that into consideration. You just want to do very small turns, test, and then repeat if needed. For this console specifically, I'm going to be replacing the laser with a replacement laser from Total Console. I got this off of Amazon. It was $29. These come from the factory with anti-static solder blobs on the bottom of the replacement laser. So what I do is grab my soldering iron, I preheat it, and grab my microscope. If you don't own a microscope, this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do this. The microscope just makes this easier to ensure that I'm not overheating the ribbon cable on the bottom of the new replacement laser. I just use a small dab of flux. I grab my soldering iron and my solder wick braid. I place the solder braid over the anti-static solder blobs, press down with the soldering iron. As soon as I notice the solder wick starts to suck up the solder, I then remove the iron and the braid at the same time. I will then come in with a saturated Q-tip with 99% isopropyl alcohol and clean up any of the residual flux that is still on the bottom of the laser. From here, there are 2 things that we will need off of the original laser. One is the arm that guides the laser on the worm gear. This uses a small Phillips head screwdriver. I will then go ahead and take that and place it onto the new laser. I will then need to remove a small Torx bit style screw that guides the laser on a slide rail. Again, this uses a small Torx bit. I remove the small Torx bit screw and install it onto the new laser itself. What I do is essentially I tighten it all the way down and then I back it out at least 1 to 1.5 turns. From here, you can then go ahead and reinstall the new aftermarket laser and test it again to see if it works. Once your laser is ready to put in, go ahead and reinstall the ribbon cable, reinstall the slide rail, and install the screw that holds the slide rail in place. From there, I will reinstall the disk tray and place the top cover of the disk drive itself back on it because there is a magnet that sucks up the PlayStation 2 disk to the spindle. So you will need to do this or the disk won't spin properly. From here, I will do one more test to test a PlayStation 1 disc with a black bottom, a PlayStation 2 disc with a blue bottom, a PlayStation 2 disc with a silver bottom, and a PlayStation 2 disc with a gold bottom, or again, for this instance, because I don't own a PlayStation 2 disc with a gold bottom, I will use a DVD that has a gold bottom or a gold layer. So as you can see in this video, it is reading the PlayStation 1 disc without any issues. After you have installed your new laser, or if you want, you can also do this to test the original laser as well. This is what I would consider to be kind of my own hack. This is also what they do when anybody talks about P-mapping on a PlayStation 2. But essentially, P-mapping, they solder a unit to the bottom of the motherboard, and then it basically goes through a program on your computer which helps to read where the laser sits. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install a disk and take this magnet from the top shell of the disk drive and place that onto the CD spindle. This will help keep the PlayStation 2 disc in place. The small white cog gear on the back helps to tune or tweak the laser to read properly. Essentially what that does is it moves the laser either up or down further away from the disc, because the laser itself, if it's too close, it will have trouble reading, and if it's too far away, it will also have trouble reading. So it has to be kind of centered in between. Now, to get it to read discs properly, take the format that doesn't read, so whether it's a silver PS2 disc or a gold PS2 disc, or if it doesn't read the black PS1 disc or the blue PS2 disc, this may help. So essentially what I do is I start from a neutral position. So once you open the cover up, wherever it's sitting, wherever that white cog gear is sitting, take a black Sharpie and mark it. That's going to be your baseline for where this adjustment screw is and where you essentially move it to. I start the PS2 up with the disc inside, with the disc tray removed and the top cover removed, obviously. And then what I will do is I will load it into the browser, and I will keep tweaking that small white cog gear by 2 teeth. So I will turn it 1, 2, test it again. You may end up having to restart the PS2 and then try it again. But basically all you're going to do is you're just going to continue to move that cog gear by 1 or 2 teeth and then retest. 1 or 2 teeth and then retest. This might take you a little bit, but essentially this is what they do for P-mapping. The only difference between this and P-mapping is you're not having to solder on a motherboard to the bottom of the PlayStation 2's motherboard to run it into a computer through a program. This is essentially like a bare bones style P-mapping where you're just using your own intellectual abilities to move the cog gear by 1 or 2 teeth, test, move the cog gear 1 or 2 teeth, test. I've been able to recover or refurbish a couple of PlayStation 2s where it wouldn't read certain formats. So there's a few PS2s where it wouldn't read the silver or the gold layer discs that run off of the DVD diode. So this actually helps. And it does actually fix a lot of the issues with the PlayStation 2s having disc read errors. And last but not least, that very small black screw that we put into the laser, you may need to adjust that as well. What that screw does is it allows the laser to move vertically up or down. So if it's still having trouble reading, you may have to adjust that, reinstall the disc, start the PlayStation 2 up until it works. I've had to do this on a couple of different PlayStation 2s, and this does work. There's no need to actually solder or get some sort of fancy, P-mapping system to refurbish PlayStation 2s. I would say that this is a much more gritty style of refurbishing, but it does work. And I've had a few PlayStation 2s that were very successful in this style of tweaking the lasers. So as you can now see, I am running Tony Hawk's Underground without issue on this PlayStation 2. So the laser I know itself is good. I should be able to run all formats of both PS1 and PS2 discs. So at this point, if you want, you can go back through and retest the laser to ensure that it reads all formats before moving on to the next step. So now let's move on to the actual refurbishing process. I then go ahead and start the disassembly process on the console. Since we've already removed the screws for the top shell, I can then go ahead and flip that off of the top of the console and lay it to the side. The disk drive top cover and the disk drive tray have already been unscrewed, so we can then go ahead and remove those and set those to the side. From here, we have to remove 2 screws holding down the motherboard to the bottom case. This requires a Phillips head screwdriver. There's 1 screw in between the fan and the power switch. There should also be 1 more screw towards the side of the case near the power switch as well. From there, you should be able to remove the whole insides from the bottom shell. From here, we're going to remove the power button from the top shell. It's easiest to use a small plastic pry tool to pop this up and remove it. It requires a little bit of force, and there is a small plastic peg that sits inside of the top of the shell that holds the power button in place. Be sure not to break that, as it will break if you apply too much force. A small amount of force is needed to pop that power button up. From here, we can then go ahead and flip the motherboard and everything over and remove the power supply itself. The power supply is normally held on by 4 small Phillips head screws. Once the power supply is unscrewed and removed, you can then go ahead and remove this protective cover and disconnect the PS2 fan and set that to the side as well. Now at this point, I do want to mention there are about 9 or 10 small Phillips head screws holding this bottom heatsink onto the motherboard. Unfortunately, this console was already taken apart once before in an attempt to try and fix it. Once you have these small screws removed from the bottom heatsink, you can then go ahead and use a plastic pry tool to remove the disk tray from the bottom heatsink and the motherboard. This uses a little bit of force, but you're essentially going to take a small pry tool and pry the clips from the back of the disk drive off of the bottom heatsink. Again, this is after you've removed the screws holding the bottom heatsink to the motherboard itself. It should then just lift up. Go ahead and place that to the side. We are then going to remove the ribbon cables and the connectors holding the power button and the disk tray to the actual motherboard itself. For the ribbon cables that are clipped onto the motherboard itself, I generally try to use a plastic pry tool with a small amount of force, lifting one edge at a time until the clip comes undone, and then I remove the ribbon cable. Once all of the ribbon cables are removed, you can then go ahead and take your disk drive and set that to the side. With everything set to the side, you can then go ahead and flip it over and remove the top heatsink. At this point, what I will do is also inspect the thermal pads on the bottom of the heatsink just to ensure that they're not hard, cracked, or damaged. I then go ahead and remove the memory card retainer. This uses 1 small Phillips head screw. It's smaller than the rest of the screws on the actual shell itself, as you can see here. So if you get these mixed up, just look for the smaller Phillips head screw. I then use a small plastic pry tool to basically pry this up. Again, there's some small little pegs that are built into the top of the shell. The memory card slot doors essentially just slide in and out. All you have to do is just push them out from the front and they all come out. You can then go ahead and take this and set it to the side. As for the disk tray itself, I then go ahead and remove this metal slide rail. This has a small flat Phillips head screw. Set that to the side and remove the slide rail. As for the disk tray top cover, I then go ahead and remove this magnet. There's a few different variations of this, so if yours doesn't come out that easily, you may have to just go ahead and clean it by hand. As you can see here, this disk tray cover with the magnet inside is very hard to remove. Although not impossible, it does take some finagling to get it out. Just to show you guys, for an instance, you would basically essentially have to use a small flathead screwdriver, pry up one of those tabs, and then twist it out of place. They're not very easy to get out, so I would recommend if you go to clean this, just wipe it down with some good 90% isopropyl alcohol and set it to the side. As for the disk tray itself, it's pretty easy to disassemble. There's 2 Phillips head screws on the back that hold the actual laser assembly in place. Remove those 2 Phillips screws and set them to the side. And for reference, they look like this. They're flat on the top, they have a small barrel, and then a small amount of thread at the bottom. To remove the actual laser from the housing, there's 2 clips on the side which need to be depressed to pop these detents out. You can use your fingers or a small plastic pry tool, but essentially from the bottom, you're going to want to apply a little bit of pressure as you try to force those tabs out and pop the detent out from the housing. From here, you kind of have to finagle it out, but that is your entire laser assembly with your motor and top hat. From here, I will then go ahead and remove the screw holding the cover over the actual cog gears and drive belt. There's a few different variations of this, so if yours doesn't have a screw on the top, you may have to actually remove the disc tray to get the screw to remove that to replace the drive belt. There's another small Phillips head screw holding in the side. I remove that and then attempt to finagle this little cover off of the actual drive itself. I plan on actually washing the whole disk drive housing itself, so I'm going to remove all of these wires. If you want, you can then go ahead and remove this switch from the side, which uses a small Phillips head screwdriver, and set that to the side. I would recommend setting the switch and the screw down together, so this way you don't get them mixed up. From here, I'm going to remove the clock battery on the side of the disk drive, remove the drive belt and the cog gears, and with two more small Phillips head screws, I'm going to remove the actual drive belt motor itself. Again, these use two very small Phillips head screws. Once those are out, you can then go ahead and pull the motor itself out. There is one more switch, another small Phillips head screw, pull that out and set it to the side. From here, you can then take the frame and wash it. I then take all of the plastic pieces and put them in a bucket of hot soapy water and let them sit for a couple minutes before scrubbing them with a soft bristle toothbrush. This is going to help ensure that I get any sort of dust, dirt, or debris off of these. If you're so inclined, you can actually take these outside and blow the dust off first if you'd like, but I essentially just go straight into a hot soapy bath. From here, I take each part individually and scrub them with a soft bristle toothbrush, ensuring that I go over the entire part. Once you have all of the parts scrubbed in your hot soapy water solution, you can then go ahead and rinse them off. And then what I do is bring them outside and lay them out in the sun on a towel to dry in the sun. I'll let those dry outside on the towel for a little bit while I move back inside and start to detail some of these smaller parts that I was unable to wash in the sink. These small memory card doors have small springs on them, so rather than removing those springs, I basically just use a little bit of 99% isopropyl alcohol and another soft bristle toothbrush to just kind of scrub those clean. Once they look good enough, I will use a Q-tip or cotton ball to just wipe them down and ensure that I get any sort of dirt or debris that is stuck in the crevices. As for the fan itself, I essentially take some 99% isopropyl alcohol and I spray each fan blade with a little bit of 99% isopropyl alcohol. I then take a Q-tip, and in this instance I am using a foam Q-tip to go ahead and kind of scrub each one of those little fan blades to get them as clean as I possibly can. The 99% isopropyl alcohol is best used for any electronic parts such as the fan, the motherboard, the power supply, or the power button itself. The small amount of water content in the 99% isopropyl alcohol dries much faster than 91% will. So I would highly recommend, if you're going to be doing this, to get some 99% isopropyl alcohol, as it will help ensure that none of your parts are damaged in the long run. As for the power button and the actual power plug portion, what I do is spray some 99% isopropyl alcohol on it and then use a soft bristle toothbrush to just kind of scrub any of the dirt or debris on there. I then go through with a cotton ball, wipe it down, and kind of detail this as best as I possibly can. These small foam Q-tips that have a point at the end of them are actually very nice to get into very small spots like this. I detail the power button as best as I possibly can and set that to the side. At this point, basically all I'm doing right now is just detailing anything that I didn't wash in the sink with hot soapy water. The heat sinks and these metal parts, you technically could wash in the sink with hot soapy water if you want, but for this instance, I'm just using a little bit of 99% isopropyl alcohol and just trying to get all that dust and dirt off the best that I possibly can before I reassemble the console. Once I'm happy with it, I will then go ahead and set this to the side and move on to the next part. I do the same thing for pretty much anything that I didn't wash in the sink with hot soapy water. So essentially, for pretty much every part of this, whether it's the top heatsink, the bottom heatsink, the power supply, pretty much anything like that, I basically just take 99% isopropyl alcohol, spray it down, wipe it down with a cotton ball the best that I possibly can to get any dirt or dust off of it, and then set it to the side. As for the top portion of the heatsink, I remove the old thermal pads and inspect it just to ensure that there's not a ton of dust underneath. Again, using the same process, I spray it with 99% isopropyl alcohol, wipe it down, and set it to the side. As for the thermal pad itself, if it looks dry or cracked, if it looks damaged, I would recommend replacing it. If the thermal pad still looks good, I wipe it down and reinstall it. I do the same thing on the actual power supply itself. With the power supply, essentially all I'm doing is just spraying it with 99% isopropyl alcohol and trying to get any of that dust or dirt off. Best practice is to take this outside and blow it off with some compressed air. Once you've blown it off with compressed air, if you want to detail it as I'm doing, you can then go ahead and do the exact same thing we've done for pretty much everything else. Essentially, take a little bit of 99% isopropyl alcohol, use a soft bristle toothbrush, and try to scrub the board as best as possible. Once you're happy with the power supply, you can then go ahead and set it to the side. Again, at this point, all I'm really doing is just detailing all the stuff that I wasn't able to wash in the sink with hot soapy water. Now, as for the controller ports are essentially the same. I use 99% isopropyl alcohol on a soft bristle toothbrush to just dislodge any of the dust or dirt that is on the actual port itself. What I would like to recommend is APS-C camera sensor swabs. I've used these multiple times, especially on these Sony PS2 controller ports. They're small and flat, and they allow you to get into these smaller ports where Q-tips do not reach. Again, I take some 99% isopropyl alcohol. I use a soft bristle toothbrush to just scrub and try to dislodge as much of the dirt or dust as possible. And then I take the APS-C camera sensor swab and try to get into those little nooks and crannies as best as possible. As for the actual controller ports, like the 3 small ports at the front for the first and second controller, you can use a very small pointed foam Q-tip to kind of roll in to those ports to get them clean. So what I do is I spray a little 99% isopropyl alcohol inside of those ports, take that pointed foam Q-tip and just kind of roll it in each one of those small little ports just to kind of help remove any dust, dirt, or debris that may be lodged in there. Once you're happy with it, you can then go ahead and set it to the side. As for the motherboard itself, I do the exact same thing. I hold it in one hand and I angle it at like a 35-45 degree angle, spray it with 99% isopropyl alcohol, and brush the motherboard at an angle so this way it drips down onto the towel. Again, if you want, you can go ahead and take this outside and blow it out with some compressed air, and then do the same process. But essentially, this is what I do for every single PlayStation 2. I blow the motherboard and everything off. I then take it back inside, use a little 99% isopropyl alcohol, and try to scrub in between each one of those capacitors. And I hold the board down at an angle to try and make sure that any of that 99% isopropyl alcohol runs down onto the towel itself and doesn't pool up under any one of these capacitors. I'll then take a Q-tip and try to detail the motherboard as much as possible, removing any excess dirt or dust. As for the ports on the motherboard, I do the exact same thing again. I take some 99% isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush and scrub them the best that I possibly can. This is where these small APS-C camera sensor swabs come in handy. For this AV port, I'm able to actually take this and get inside of it and clean the contacts as best as possible. Now, as for the motherboard itself, I'm then going to take the motherboard and inspect it under a microscope. I understand not everybody owns a microscope, but these do help, especially with console repairs and console refurbishing. I'm going to inspect the motherboard for any cracks in any solder and ensure that all the capacitors look good. I'm going to take a hot iron and some fresh solder and reflow a lot of this old solder, especially for the AV port, the USB ports, and the actual HDD port itself. I just want to ensure that when I go to sell this console to somebody that it should not have any issues and works properly and as intended. So I reflow these just to ensure that there's a good soldered connection. A little bit of flux goes a long way. Each one of my PS2s gets the same treatment. I essentially go through, inspect the old solder, and reflow the solder or add new solder if needed. Over time, the solder will eventually crack. So I think that this is a good process and ensuring that when you go to resell or refurbish PlayStation 2s, that there should be no issues for the foreseeable future. Again, I use a little bit of flux and some fresh solder to ensure that each one of these solder joints on here is good and has no cracks, because eventually over time solder does crack. So this should help ensure that in the long run, after I sell this console to somebody, that they shouldn't have any issues. After I'm done soldering, I use a little bit of 99% isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush to just kind of scrub any of that flux off. I'll then take a cotton ball and just dab up any of the 99% isopropyl alcohol that might still be on the board itself. Again, I continue to work the board until I'm happy with everything. I go through each one of the pins on the HDD port and ensure that each one of those has fresh new solder and is good to go. Once all of your plastic pieces are dry, you can then go ahead and start to reassemble the console. I start with the disk drive. I install the switches. I then reinstall the disc tray drive belt motor, which uses those two small Phillips head screws, and I thread that connector down through the bottom. I will then go ahead and reinstall the clock battery on the side. I then take this cover and reinstall this other switch on the side of it, and I'll set that to the side. I will then take some 99% isopropyl alcohol and detail the actual drive itself. I take a cotton swab with some 99% isopropyl alcohol and go over the actual spindle itself, ensuring that there's no dust, dirt, or debris on the actual rubber. Because if there's dust, dirt, or debris on that spindle hat, it may cause the disc to either skip or spin inside while moving. I'll then take some 99% isopropyl alcohol on a Q-tip and detail the worm gear and the slide rails for the actual disc drive itself. I will be adding some fresh white lithium grease to the rails and the worm gear later on in this video. But essentially at this point, all I'm doing really is just detailing the actual laser assembly itself. Once you have everything wiped down, you can then go ahead and reinstall the actual laser assembly back into the housing. Those two small metal tabs essentially just get set back in place where we had them originally. Once you snap them back into place, you can then go ahead and reinstall the screws that hold it in place. Again, these are the two small flat head Phillips screws that have a sort of barrel and small threads at the end. I use a little bit of synthetic oil just to kind of lubricate some of these plastic moving parts. I get a small Q-tip with a little bit of that on there, and I just go through where I know that any sort of plastic on plastic or plastic on metal are going to rub. I lightly coat each part and then reinstall it. To reinstall that slide, you essentially just have to lift the laser tray up a little bit and then pop it back into place, and then it kind of slides back in. I will then go ahead and reinstall the cog gears and the drive belt. As for the drive belt, I use this trick. If you can't source a new one, I take the old belt and put it in a cup of hot boiling water. I essentially wait for the water to cool down after about 10 or 15 minutes and then pull it out and reinstall it. I'm then going to take the rail that the actual disc tray itself slides on and clean out that barrel connection and reinstall that onto the bottom of the disc tray itself. Once that slide rail and the small plastic slider are installed, I use a little bit of the synthetic oil just to lubricate the rail itself. From here, I'm just going to use a little bit of white lithium grease, and I'm going to apply it to the worm gear that moves the laser back and forth inside of the shell. I dab a little bit onto each one of the rails and move the laser back and forth by hand, ensuring that the white lithium grease gets worked into the spots where it needs to go. I then go ahead and reinstall the drive belt and reinstall the cover that goes over the cog gears and the drive belt itself. I snake that wire through for the switch, and then I reinstall the top cover for that drive belt and the cog gears, and reinstall the two small black screws that hold that cover in place. From there, I slide the disc tray back inside of the housing itself and reinstall the two black screws that hold it in place. Before reinstalling the top cover to the disc tray, I then take a cotton ball with some 99% isopropyl alcohol and just wipe everything down, ensuring that everything is clean before I reassemble the top cover onto the actual disc drive itself. From there, you can reinstall the top cover back onto the disc drive itself. Now it's time to reassemble the actual motherboard itself. I start with the heat shield that has the fins for the heatsink on it. Once you have everything lined up, you can then go ahead and install the actual disk drive itself, because this will need to go on first. All of these wires and ribbon cables need to go under the other heat shield before reinstalling the screws. So take the disk drive and start to reinstall the ribbon cables and connectors. If you want, you can grab something to throw underneath the actual heatsink itself to hold it in place. The nice thing about the connectors on the PS2 is they are color coded, so white to white, yellow to yellow, red to red. They all have their own places and they're all color coded, so it's fairly easy to reassemble the PS2. Before going any further, ensure that you reinstall the power button as well, as it will make it much easier to reinstall it at this point. Once you have the other half of the heatsink on, it's next to impossible to really get these ribbon cables in properly without having to basically force it in. Once all of the ribbon cables and connectors are reinstalled, you can then go ahead and take that other half of the heatsink and place it back onto the motherboard itself. Also, don't forget to reinstall the controller ports, as again, this will make it much harder once you have the actual heatsink on. This bottom heatsink will clip onto the actual disk drive itself, so ensure that everything is connected before you reinstall this and start to re-screw it together. The screws for this bottom heatsink are similar to the ones that are in the disk drive, the small black Phillips head screws. The ones that go onto the bottom of the heatsink are actually all either silver or gold. Where I'm installing a screw right now requires the smaller of these small Phillips heads. It's shorter in length, so take that into consideration. Otherwise, all of the screws on the bottom of this heatsink should all be the same length, besides that one that I mentioned earlier. And this is the very small screw that I was talking about. That one goes here. Once you have the bottom heatsink installed and all of the screws installed, it's time to grab the fan and the fan and power button housing, as it will make it much easier to reinstall the fan and the power button now. Once you have the fan and power button installed into their own housing, you can then go ahead and slightly lift the motherboard itself up and shimmy that into place. Again, it's much easier to install this right now, as this small connector for the fan has to go under this plastic cover that sits underneath the power supply. Once you have that plastic cover installed, you can then go ahead and reinstall the actual power supply itself. Before installing the screws, make sure you also install the cage for the HDD, as the cage has to go on first before you install any of the Phillips head screws. The screws that hold the actual power supply on are short Phillips head screws. I take the bottom case and just ensure that I'm not installing any screws into the wrong position. There are 6 screws that go through the bottom of the PlayStation 2 that actually mount to the top shell. So if you install a screw in the wrong position, the top shell and the bottom shell will not mate properly. At this point, you can flip the PlayStation 2 over and start to carefully align the bottom shell and the motherboard and the rest of the parts in the housing. We're essentially at the home stretch now. At this point, you can then take that Phillips head screw and reinstall it in between the fan and the power connector to basically hold the motherboard in place on the actual bottom shell. There are 2 Phillips head screws that hold the controller ports in place, so you can go ahead and reinstall those. There is also one other screw over here by the power button and the power supply port that I also need to install. With those screws installed, I'm then going to go ahead and grab the top shell. From here, I'm going to take the top shell and reinstall the memory card slot doors. The springs on the memory card slot doors slide into a little detent on the top shell. With those in place, I'm then going to take the part that holds them in place and reinstall the screw. Now, the last little bit. I'm going to take the power button and reinstall it onto the top shell before closing the console back up and retesting it just to ensure everything works. Again, there's a small peg that kind of holds the power button in place. You essentially have to do this at an angle. When you go to reinstall it, you install the power button and the eject button into the slots where they go, and then with one other hand, you kind of hold it at an angle upward and slide it into place and then force it down without breaking that little peg. Hopefully that makes sense. From there, you can reinstall all of the case screws. Once the console is reassembled, I then go ahead and set it up and retest all of the formats again. A black PlayStation 1 disc, a blue PlayStation 2 disc, a silver PlayStation 2 disc, and a gold PlayStation 2 disc, or for this instance, a gold layer DVD, as I don't own a gold layer PS2 disc. Once I'm happy with it and I ensure everything works, I then go ahead and take pride and then play a little bit of each one of those games as a kind of reward to myself for doing such a great job. Anyways, this is how I refurbish PlayStation 2s. If you guys like this video, go ahead, give it a thumbs up, give it a like. If you didn't like this video, also give it a thumbs up. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit all the buttons. I'm Jordan, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.